Hey guys, Jay Sensational here, and today I have a little bit of a different video that I was actually really motivated to make. If you guys remember, I brought Yasuo Katarina to the first seasonal tournament and actually placed in the top 16 with it. But ever since then, or well, ever really since the inception of Yasuo as kind of a champion and an archetype, there's been very, very little support for the champion. And he hasn't seen any competitive play in maybe like the last even 6 months, something really, really long like that. And so I wanted to make this video, especially with a lot of the Shrima champions that actually look kind of similar and do a very similar thing that Yasuo does. Sometimes very loosely, and I'll touch up a little bit more on this as well. But I wanted to outline what exactly kind of makes Yasuo not a great champion within Legends of Runeterra, because I think the issue itself is not as simple as it seems, and we'll try to cover a lot of the build arounds, just the idea of Yasuo as a champion and what it wants to do, and we'll look into all this and that and really think about how exactly we can maybe buff Yasuo or have more support cards that actually kind of do something meaningful. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. But if you guys do want to see more of this content, please leave a comment down below, maybe with what champion you want to see next, and to do like a deep dive on what makes it good, what makes it bad, things like that. And please drop a like and a subscribe because it really helps me out. But without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So for those of you who don't know what Yasuo does, because I wouldn't be surprised if you haven't seen this champion being played whatsoever, and so it might not, guys might not know what the card actually does. So Yasuo is a 4-mana Ionian champion. That's a 4/4 quick attacker that says when you stun or recall an enemy, I deal 2 damage to it. And once you've stunned or recalled 5 units, Yasuo levels up, and then now every time you stun or recall an enemy, he strikes it. So when he's leveled up, he has 5 attack, and every time you play a stun card, you'll strike the enemy for 5 damage. And there's a little bit of support for Yasuo. Most of it, of course, is within Ionia. You see a lot of stun cards related around it, like Steel Tempest and Concussive Palm. There's also minions like Mina Swiftfoot, Blade Fate Twirler, and things like that. Now, outside of Ionia, there are 2 main regions that have kind of been exploring this stun mechanic, those being Noxus and Targon. Noxus has kind of been the staple to this. We have cards like Arachnoid Sentry, Intimidating Roar, Ravenous Flock, things like that. But recently, Targon has been seeing a little bit more experimentation with the stun mechanic. The first kind of exploration into this was through Leona, in which each time you daybreak on the first turn, or each time you activate Daybreak, Leona would stun an enemy. But recently, they've released cards like the Cloven Way, which is like a double stun on the same unit if they are a faller, and cards like Gravitum, which can be pulled off of Aphelios. So just looking at Yasuo on paper, it seems that it would be hard to believe that Yasuo isn't really a good champion for a 4-mana 4/4 quick attacker. That's a very decent stat line, and it kind of has like a bonus effect stapled on top of it. Each time Yasuo is on the board and you stun a unit, then that unit will be dealt 2 damage. And so very commonly, even just looking at Yasuo on paper, it doesn't seem that bad. But before I kind of want to go into some of the holes within Yasuo's design, I want to just compare it to 2 very similar decks that kind of are built similarly to how Yasuo decks would be built out, and really talk about why these decks work, but Yasuo doesn't. So on the very first, we have an all-in Fiora deck. The one that I will be talking about is the Freljord Fiora deck. And why this is somewhat similar to Yasuo is that they both have very high deck building costs. Yasuo wants to be playing stuns in his deck, and Fiora wants to be playing combat spells, so like single combat and concerted strike. The reason why an all-in Fiora deck works is not only because they have access to Entreat, which basically acts like you're running 6 Fioras in the deck, so it's much easier to draw into Yasuo. The region also runs a lot of efficient protection tools to keep Fiora alive because both decks do require on their champions in order to sustain themselves throughout the game. But what really separates Fiora from Yasuo is that Fiora as itself is a self-sustained win condition, and if you manage to keep Fiora alive, you pretty much win the game, just on the spot, and that's kind of how the deck works. Whereas if you keep Yasuo alive, sure, all you're doing is just trading stuns for their opponent's units, and so you're kind of one-on-one-ing card resource away, but that doesn't really help you win the game. Secondly, we have Ezreal decks. This can kind of range between a lot of different Ezreal builds, but most popular is Ezreal with Draven. And you'll often be running a lot of removal cards like Mystic Shock, Get Excited, and Static Shock. So both decks are kind of similar in the sense that, as a Yasuo deck, you're running stuns and Yasuo levels off of stuns, and then Ezreal's running like these removal cards, and then each time you target a unit, Ezreal kind of levels up. And they both have like this deal 2 thing that's kind of similar. It's a little bit more of a stretch, but hopefully you'll see where I'm going with this. So the main difference between Ezreal decks and Yasuo decks are really what the cards do. Not only is Ezreal able to generate fleeting mystic shots of his own, which not only progress his level up, but also help to control the opponent's board. But the removal cards that you do run in Ezreal decks actually remove the units. Not needing to have Ezreal on board for Mystic Shot to deal 2 is a really important feature. And also that the removal cards have the flexibility to be used as burn cards. And so there's a two-factor thing that makes these removal cards so much better. And because we have this non-conditional removal in Ezreal decks, we can actually play like a control deck, whereas Yasuo needs to be on board for these stun cards to really function as a type of control tool. So this comes to the main issue with trying to build around stuns and build around Yasuo is the fact that stuns themselves are stall cards and not removal cards. I make the comparison to Ezreal because I think that it's likely for someone to compare a card like Mystic Shot to a card like Steel Tempest. They both are 2 mana, they are both fast speed cards, and they functionally do something very, very similar. When cast in combat against an enemy's attack turn, you often want to be using these cards to stop a unit's attack. And, while Mystic Shot deals 2 to a unit, if we're talking about like a bigger unit, like a 5/5, then situationally, Steel Tempest can be better in some times. And then when you have Yasuo on board combined with Steel Tempest, I think that a lot of players see this combination and then think that Steel Tempest is just suddenly a much better card than Mystic Shot because not only is this combination dealing 2 damage to the unit, it's also knocking them out of combat by stunning them. And factually, this is correct, but because this is so conditional of needing Yasuo on board, when you don't have Yasuo on board, Steel Tempest and pretty much any other stun card really, really pales in comparison. The importance of being able to remove an opponent's unit off the board is just so high, especially if you're trying to make this a control archetype, which Yasuo definitely tries to push its build around against. Because if you only stun a unit from combat, then on the next attack turn, they get an attack again. And then now you just traded down 1 card to pretty much stall for 1 turn, and you're not really progressing your control game plan any further. And what makes this even worse is the more you try to build into Yasuo by like adding either more stun cards like Steel Tempest, even Guiles, or like Concussive Palms, you'll find that you'll very quickly run out of value because you're not trading one-to-one with the opponent, unlike other removal tools that PNZ has. But you're also falling into the trap where if you don't draw Yasuo, these control stun cards become very, very weak. I also want to brush up on, some decks that have run stun cards and have done decently well, and why putting those stun cards in Yasuo decks, in which you'd think that they would do better because Yasuo synergizes with stuns, that's not exactly the case. So a few decks that historically have run a few stun cards have been Ezreal Karma, Feel the Rush Ionia, and to a lesser extent Lee Sin. Ezreal Karma has run stun cards like Steel Tempest occasionally, Feel the Rush Ionia, or Feel the Mina, has run cards like Concussive Palms, and Lee Sin has sometimes run Concussive Palms as well, and these decks have been doing very well with these cards. But the main reason why these decks can perform well with these stun cards that Yasuo doesn't really is the fact that these decks have late game win conditions. Once Karma is enlightened and levels up, you can often just outvalue your opponent. If you stall to turn 8 or 9 and are able to cast Feel the Rush, you pretty much win. If you stall with Lee Sin and then that was the turn that you need to slap Zenith Blade onto it, you pretty much win. And the reason why these decks need the stall is because that with the stall, they can get to the late game and just win the game. Whereas Yasuo doesn't really have that capability. If you don't have Yasuo, you're using your stun cards to stall until you draw Yasuo, but then you're just playing from behind there because now you're using the same stall cards to kind of try to catch up as removal, and that doesn't really work. You're just playing a control deck from behind, and you're not really progressing towards any win condition of your own. And so this is a very critical reason why stun cards, even though they are supposedly very synergistic with Yasuo, they don't really have a good purpose within Yasuo's deck core. So with that in mind, what kind of decks does Yasuo fit in? We've kind of covered on the concept that you can't really have an all-in Yasuo deck. That kind of just doesn't really make sense because you're just playing like a very conditional control deck that has to have Yasuo on board, and if you don't, then you're just kind of stalling in order to play a control deck. And so Yasuo decks can't really rely on Yasuo. This seems really strange, but the decks that do perform or have performed okay while still having Yasuo as a champion can either be split into two separate categories. The first one is an aggressive stun deck. This is the deck concept that I brought to the seasonals that I felt did decently well in the meta that it was viable in. And this features Yasuo Katarina, and that uses your stuns very, very aggressively to scale your cards like Fade Blade Twirler and Legion General to really close out the game with some very aggressive rallies. In this deck, Yasuo doesn't need to be drawn to win games, but can serve as a good unit to not only pair with Katarina because it is still a 4-mana 4/4 quick attack that actually puts some pressure on the opponent, but just being able to remove 1 or 2 units to make way for your big units to hit the Nexus can be really important. I think the second kind of box that Yasuo fits in are decks that can kind of utilize Yasuo as a decent support tool. Decks that we have seen this work into a decent extent has been Yasuo Swain, Yasuo Leona, and for a lesser part, Yasuo Aphelios. So Yasuo Swain and Yasuo Leona, these aren't Yasuo decks per se. This is a Swain deck, and this is a Leona deck. Um, some of these decks sometimes rely a little bit too much on Yasuo, depending on how you build them. And that's kind of the trap where you don't want to build too much into Yasuo. So for this Swain deck, you don't want to be relying on Yasuo to have to level up your Swain. You want to be running a few more Noxus cards that kind of levels up Swain by itself. But, once you hit the late game, you have Swain, Leviathan, Yasuo on board, and that can kind of just clear the opponent's units. And before that, sometimes you have Yasuo kind of stall the game out until your late game Sway Leviathan combo. Kind of a very similar story with Yasuo Leona. You have the combination of stunning with Leona and removing with Yasuo that can kind of help you stall throughout the early game and have a very aggressive daybreak, aggressive mid-range units throughout. And then in the late game, you have your pretty standard target win conditions like star shaping to really close out games. Yeah, so Aphelios might be one of the borderline decks that actually goes a little bit more into Yasuo because in this deck you're able to tutor out Fate Blade Twirler, for example. You have Gravitum that really helps you turbo level up Yasuo, and maybe you're running like the new Cloven Way, which is like a second Gravitum. Unfortunately, this kind of falls into the same issue where now if you don't draw Yasuo and now you don't draw Aphelios, your deck really doesn't do anything. Or depending on how you built it, if you draw Yasuo but don't draw Aphelios, then not being able to cycle Gravitums kind of diminishes your strength as a deck. And then both champions themselves aren't win conditions either. You might be running cards like Eclipse Dragon or Mind Splitter as kind of late game bombs to really help you close out games. But these are some deck concepts that Yasuo can find a spot in as long as he isn't the main card you're trying to build your deck around. So with all of that in mind, let's kind of talk about how we can think about buffing Yasuo. And this is coming from me, who I am not a game designer by any means. The only qualification I have to talk about this is the fact that I've played Yasuo for maybe 100 or so games. And so I think that I'm pretty comfortable with looking at which cards aren't good, even in a Yasuo deck, and how Yasuo could be better. There's four main categories that I'd like to talk about in thinking about what cards would make Yasuo better. The first set of cards are stun cards that are better than the old stun cards. So a good example of this is comparing a card like Concussive Palm to Steel Tempest. Both without Yasuo kind of do very similar things, but Concussive Palm is a body with a stun. This is kind of what makes cards like Arachnoid Sentry a lot better than a card like Steel Tempest. Next, we have cards such like Intimidating Roar and the Targon Sneaky Zeebles that kind of helps you to come back from a board advantage when you drop Yasuo on 4 and then have like a board wipe on 5 with Intimidating Roar or Sneaky Zeebles, depending on the opponent's deck. And having more of these comeback cards once you have Yasuo down can help you stabilize instead of playing like 3 Concussive Palms to try to remove 3 units turn after turn. Having these board wipe stuns can really help buff Yasuo because this will help turbo level him, and this would help you remove the board and have a nice tempo swing turn. And then there's cards like Gravitum, of course, that are just really good at doing what they do. Having a 2-turn stun for 2 mana is obviously really good. And if there are better stun cards printed in the future, then these are all indirect buffs to Yasuo. Having to rely on cards like Steel Tempest that are only stall cards, and comparing that to like Arachnoid Sentry, which can be a stun with a body and be used very aggressively, makes a very big difference on the support cards within Yasuo's archetype. The next set of cards are the stun support cards. These are the cards that work really well, given that you have stun cards in your deck. And these are cards like Ravenous Flock, which is probably one of the strongest cards that a Yasuo deck can really run because it's just so efficient at what it does. And the same thing to a lesser extent is Paddlestar. They both do 4 damage to a stun unit. And is really important because now you have a card that makes your stall cards into removal. And this is the concept that we were talking about earlier that is something that Yasuo really lacks as a deck. And then the third thing is cards that kind of scale off of your stuns. So this being Fey Blade Twirler, Legion General are the two main ones that get bigger as long as you play more stun cards and can actually help you to snowball some advantage that you're kind of losing. These become really aggressive cards and can be used that way with your stuns to kind of flip the game around and start applying a lot of pressure to your opponent. I think the easiest one to look at when thinking about this is simply just tweaking Yasuo's numbers around. This is kind of a cop-out and probably doesn't really address the core issue of Yasuo and the way he's built, but we've seen a similar treatment to Lee Sin, where just changing his mana cost, changing his level up condition um, has drastically seen Lee Sin's play rate and popularity and power level just skyrocket and drop drastically. The reason why this is kind of a cop out is that we can either make Yasuo really strong just because it's a really strong card, or we can make him like unplayable if we don't have enough stats or anything like that. But this doesn't address the fact that it has too much reliance on the stun factor to really make a big difference to the core of what he's doing. It's not a very thematic change because if we just make Yasuo strong, then the stun cards and the support cards are still weak, so that doesn't really make sense. The fourth and final bucket is having a tutor for Yasuo. And this is probably one of the really core concepts that a lot of people have been kind of asking about because a tutor for Yasuo is so core, and just being able to draw and play Yasuo is really important for any deck trying to build around him. Something like Draven's biggest fan to Draven is a very, very strong concept, and just being able to curve biggest fan and have Draven on the earliest that you can make a huge difference. A lot of people have also been kind of talking about having Yone being a Yasuo tutor, not only being able to stun two enemies on board, but also drawing Yasuo can be pretty decent. The only issue with a Yasuo tutor like Yone being 7 mana is kind of the same issue with stun cards being a stall card that's not stalling you towards any win condition. You need to have Yasuo down early on board to really make your stun cards effective to act as removal in order to snowball an advantage forward. And if you have a 7 mana tutor for Yasuo, or like any of the ship cards that are kind of tutors for their own prospective champions, this is often too late. And now, after turn 7, you play Yasuo on turn 8, and then finally you can actually make effective use of your stun cards. You're again playing a control deck from behind, and that doesn't really work. So a Yasuo tutor has to be an early tutor, and probably being able to play Yasuo down by turn 4 or turn 5. So again, I mentioned that I am not a game designer by any means. I don't know if any of these changes are balanced or how drastically they would affect Yasuo as a champion, but I think that I have 3 suggestions on how exactly I would approach changing Yasuo that I feel makes sense to what Yasuo is trying to do. Very quickly, Yasuo is kind of meant to be a more control card, obviously turning the stuns into dealing 2 damage or dealing 5 damage when leveled is kind of a very control archetype. You want to be playing Yasuo down and then controlling the board. And so in the same light of being a control deck, I think that these changes would kind of be appropriate. The first suggestion I have is an Ezreal approach. Ezreal, when they strike the Nexus, they add a fleeting copy of Mystic Shot to your hand. So this not only helps proc Ezreal's level up by adding a fleeting Mystic Shot in hand so that he's kind of generating value on his own, this also is another removal card in your deck. And so for Yasuo, this would be Nexus Strike, add a Steel Tempest to your hand. Now, of course, this doesn't make sense to be fleeting because you can't play it on your attack turn. But now the opponent is put into a situation where they either block unfavorably into Yasuo and they sacrifice a unit against the quick attack, or they have to give you a Steel Tempest in hand, which you can use on your next attack turn or your next defensive turn to kind of play a similar role. This means that your opponent has to be trading unfavorably into Yasuo, or else they have to be letting you stun one of their bigger units next turn, which is kind of a good fork in a control deck. And this, of course, gives Yasuo value in order to sustain himself and also help him level up a little bit faster. The second change I would make is just a real straight buff approach. This is making his level up easier, because even though level 1 Yasuo is kind of a bad effect, its leveled up one is actually really, really powerful. Being able to deal 5 damage to any unit that you've stunned is pretty much playing a flock without having to play a flock type of thing. It is very, very powerful, and having a leveled up Yasuo even 1 or 2 turns earlier is really strong and can just swing board states around, because now you're just removing units straight out. And some of the cards are actually 2-for-1s because it's a body with a stun. And so if the level up is changed to 3 or 4 units, this can be really, really powerful because this capitalizes on Yasuo's effect quicker and can swing board states around faster. The third approach is the tutor approach. Like I've mentioned, having a tutor for Yasuo is really, really important to the control archetype, because if you don't draw Yasuo, you're not controlling anything. And so I got this idea off of the card Preservarium, which is one of the new Shrima landmarks that uses this countdown mechanic to kind of work. And I think something very, very flavorful to Yasuo that would still make sense is for any of those who have watched the Spirit Blossom Festival cinematic by Riot, in which case it shows Yone and Yasuo fighting in the Ionian fields. I think that a card such like Preservarium that has countdown 2, draw Yasuo, and countdown 4, draw Yone, or something very similar to a double tutor like that, makes a lot of sense thematically. And of course, if you play this card on 2, because it costs, I think it would still cost 2 mana. So it's a 2 mana draw 4 over 4, or 2 mana draw 2 over 4 turns, but is a very specific tutor. It can be really powerful to Yasuo's archetype, because you play this on 2, you're giving up your turn 2, in which case you might want to develop, because you still need to stall a little bit in order to get to turn 4 when you finally draw and play Yasuo. So this is a trade-off card already for a card that kind of wants to stall early games with cheap units. But you're able to play Yasuo on 4, which is really critical to advance your control game plan. And then, of course, if you get to countdown 4, which is 1 turn before you're able to play Yone, assuming you drop this on curve, you can have a little bit of it's not even a finisher, but just like a payoff card to having Yasuo alive on board and adding more draw into a region that really needs it. One factor that I didn't really cover in this video so far is the fact that any region that Yasuo is in or is paired with has very, very little draw. And for a deck that's so conditional on drawing Yasuo, this doesn't really make much sense. And so instead of drastically changing Yasuo in any way, outside of the 2 suggestions that I've added, a tutor for Yasuo or some sort of added draw mechanic for these regions is very, very appreciated by this Yasuo archetype. That's kind of where I'll leave it there. I've actually been talking for a really, really long time, and so I hope I haven't bored any of you away. But if you guys like this kind of video, you liked hearing my thoughts on underrated, not even underrated at this point, just a bad champion, and my thoughts on how exactly you can look at improving it, please let me know. And if you like to see more, feel free to comment down a champion that you would like to see my thoughts on, and I'll look into those as well. But that's kind of the end of where I want to leave this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed, and if you did, please again drop a like and a subscribe, and it really helps me out. And I'll leave it there, but I'll catch you guys later.